Greetings and welcome to Manibil. So this might look like some kind of mind explosion I'm presenting here on my stream presentation, but I have been wanting for a while to do some kind rather than a text-based description of, let's say, a complete philosophical structure, but rather a sort of, let's say, diagram that more precisely describe dependencies. But I think a key to good philosophy is dependency. What is dependent on what, right? Now, after, in particular, and you might say I am bashing and I'm obsessed with, Bernardo Kastrup and so on. I guess it's because that the more I listen to him, the more frustrated I get about his use of words, use of terms, equivocations, his, what's it called, conflation of meanings and terms, and like having 4 or 5 different terms for whatever it is everything is made of, right? Mind and consciousness and subjectivity and pure awareness and the list almost goes on, right? Yeah, there are probably a few I've forgotten, right? Though that sounds maybe like a straw man, right? Maybe it is. But I was fiddling about with this one yesterday evening, and I kept having trouble making it coherent. I had trouble making it. It was something like, yeah, this looks fine, but it doesn't have that cohesion to it that I'm looking for. And all of a sudden, it just dawned on me. It just like one of these aha moments, right? And I need to further clarify. I can't just give you that aha moments all of just like that. But it's not like it was sort of embedded in all my thinking. It was just sort of clarified to me how my philosophy actually works. And you could say, and I will be on the on the wall defending this to be in a military analogy, right? That you should always have your own philosophy. This is my philosophy, right? And I try to reflect on other people's philosophy in order to improve my own. I'm not trying to defend my own philosophy. I'm not saying I came up with something. Now I'm standing here shooting everybody, trying to get in and criticize, right? That's stupid. But it's a difficult task. Both, I've talked about this for almost 10 years, right? Philosophizing is difficult because as soon as it's sort of the rabbit hole idea, right? That you fall further and further and further down this rabbit hole. First you fall a little step and say, oh, there's something different here. Let me put things together. Okay, now it seems to work. And then you fall a bit deeper, right? Oh, there was something I had overlooked there. And then you try to hone it and clarify it and so on, right? So at the same time, you have to trust the validity of your philosophy. You also constantly have to scrutinize whether or not it's actually functional. What I hear usually is people who said, I've came up with it 10 years ago. I've defended it tooth and nail for 10 years now, right? The most ridiculous example may be Stephen Molyneux, right? Where his so-called universally preferable behavior, which is his approach to ethics. And it's basically one big pile of nothing, right? If you read his book, and I've deconstructed on my site here, on my channel here, so you can go back and check out his UPB thing I've deconstructed, right? It has a bit of years on it, so if I were to do it today, I would probably do it differently and more coherently than I did back then. But at least, right? And it's atrociously bad writing, right? So I wouldn't want to go back and try another time, right? Why would I spend time on that dude? He's an amateur when it comes to philosophy, in my opinion, right? But what was I trying to say? Yes, his book UPB is written something like 20 years ago now, right? He hasn't changed a fucking comma in anything, right? It's the same old, tired, half-ass arguments he used to. I mean, and the arguments and the structure of the thinking, it's so atrociously bad. It's on another level bad kind of thing you're doing. It's like, it's this, if something is slightly wrong with something, right? If you're sort of, hey, I'm going to show you my new bicycle, right? And the seat is a little too low, for instance, then you can sort of adjust the seat and then things are okay, right? But if somebody says, I'm showing you a new bicycle, and they have a plastic bag with twigs and gravel in it, I'm like, this is on another level problem with the bicycle, right? It maybe it's a little hyperbolic, but it's the same. Sometimes the problem is so huge, they're so far, you have to go completely back to the drawing board, mate. I won't spend time on you, right? And that's how I'm dealing with Stefan Monio at this point, right? He's a lost cause. But if it's how do people approach the idea of philosophy, right? What I'm hearing, of course, it's because it's built into the how it expresses it is of this idea of philosophy, right? Those I'm hearing are those who are explicit about their philosophy, obviously. Those who stick to themselves and have their own philosophy, I'm never going to hear about them. They're not writing, they're not talking, they're not, right? So how do you approach that? Because usually those who are very bombastic about philosophy, it's because they want to tell other people how to think, right? What to think and how to think, right? They call it their own philosophy, but usually they're going to appeal to, no, it's not my philosophy, it is sort of the philosophy, right? As if everything has been solved now. No, it's your philosophy, right? It's my philosophy, it's your philosophy. And in order to sort of get that input I talked about before, where I'm sort of scrutinizing and solidifying my own philosophy, it has to sort of condense into something that is sort of useful, right? And it doesn't have to be too complicated. I don't like this extreme complication of things. And it's these intellectuals and academics. I have a book by a guy, it's actually right here. I found it yesterday. And I actually think it's a first edition, but that's another story. A book by Paul Johnson called Intellectuals, right? That talks about how intellectuals, what they think about themselves, and they're sort of superior to everybody else, right? So when you're dealing with philosophy, you're usually dealing with people who are very good at juggling abstractions. They're very good at juggling words and terms and coming up with things, coming up with language that sounds like they are very knowledgeable, and you have to sort of you're being duped into thinking that they're actually smart because they're using this fancy term, right? And if they can't make some good philosophy or something, they can at least make some new terms they can throw at you and say, hey, I came up with a new term, I created an ism, so now there's new philosophy here, right? And it's usually, old wine on new bottles, right? With new labels on. So I feel I'm rambling a bit, but you're probably wondering what it is I'm presenting here, right? And in the other presentations of my ontology, I have described sort of would you call that structure list, point 1, point 2, or bullet 1, bullet 2, bullet 3, or sort of. But the structure of it is obviously more intertwined. And that's what I'm trying to describe here without going into all sorts of unnecessary details, right? The picture is obviously, maybe it's not obvious, but it's probably more detailed if you were to describe all ends of this, right? This is in order to get a point across. And I sort of cherry-picked, I hesitate to use that term, but I picked those aspects of it that are important to get the point across. Okay. So it's still, as usual, work in progress, right? Ontology. Basically what you're doing when you're doing ontology, in my opinion, is describing the whole toolbox, right? All that you have to work with, so to say, right? And how it's structured, how it's categorized, how it's classified, and its dependencies and interdependencies and so on, right? And there are maybe two aha moments, sort of two small aha moments that coalesces into one big aha moment, right? First of all, as you can see in the yellow area, I have confined everything to be ontology, right? Everything is ontology. If I talk about epistemology, that is the content of an abstraction called labeled as epistemology, but which contains something like knowledge and truth, or some conclusions, which would be knowledge, truth, and objectivity, right? And the same goes for ethics, which is an abstraction that contains a set of thinking that coalesces into a conclusion called a moral principle, right? And the same goes for physics. It's a particular kind of abstraction based on various other aspects within the ontology that coalesces into the idea of science or the scientific method, right? And the external world is also an abstraction. So all these things, epistemology, external world, ethics, physics, and so on, are all a part of the ontology. What I'm merely saying is, when I look at that particular abstraction called epistemology, there is something that is it's a set of thoughts and conclusions. But since I have access to them, they must be some part of my ontology, right? And as you might know from my prior ontology presentation, I work with three categories, which is qualia, or qualia, maybe. I usually call it qualia, but I think it's called, people seems to use the term qualia, but never mind. But qualia, tomato, right? Qualia A, qualia B, cognitions, and C, abstractions, right? That in order to have cognitions, you need qualia. You won't have any cognitions if you don't have any qualia, right? And if you don't have any qualia, you won't have any cognitions, and you won't have any abstractions, right? Now, there is this thing called memory, right? You might be in a situation right now where you have been deprived of your senses, so to say. You can't have qualia. That doesn't mean you don't have a memory. So there's something you can tap into, which is a storage facility for old qualia cognitions and abstractions and stories and whatever, whatever's in there in memory, right? But ultimately, those memories were based on some abstractions, cognitions, and qualia, and so on. So when you trace it back to its foundations, in my opinion, you always end up at qualia. And another thing that makes it very reasonable to say that qualia is the starting point, or what would otherwise be called a reduction base, is that you cannot, I struggle at least, or not only struggle, I am incapable of explaining, defining, qualifying, whatever term you want to put on it, but defining might be the best word, right? Color, for instance. What is color? The only explanations or definitions I've seen are all circular. So one way or another. They allude to being clarification, but they are merely cognitions or abstractions. They are references or taking cognitions or abstractions as an explanation of qualia that is obviously circular, right? At least according to my ontology. So I'm not going to accept it, right? So in my opinion, qualia cannot be further defined. That's why it's a reduction base. And it makes perfect sense to me, right? I mean, I open my eyes, there it is, right? I am having qualia again, right? Every fucking day I wake up, right? And I'm cognizing my bed, I'm cognizing my trousers, my toothbrush, my coffee, my espresso machine or whatever, right? My car or my lawn, or, it's the same old qualia cognition, and maybe some abstractions that are sort of, oh yeah, I need to mow my lawn, right? I abstract something from the cognition. The quality of that lawn, the qualia, the A of that B, means I abstract the idea of I need to go, and I depend on free will, of course, right? I have an abstraction called I need to mow my lawn, right? Maybe that's an appeal to physics. Well, what's the scientific method? Well, the last time I did it, it worked if I put out my lawnmower and put some gasoline on it or whatever, and, moved it across the lawn, right? That's physics, that's scientific method, right? Observation and empiricism. So that's a kind of physics abstraction. But there might be other endeavors, right? Like ethics and epistemology. So, and I also created another abstraction called external world, right? That is important. And that's where we have the problem with Bernardo Kastrup, right? In particular, there are all sorts of other problems, right? The only thing here, terms that don't think I have heard Bernardo Kastrup mention, is a moral principle. I might be wrong, but I can't remember him mentioning moral principle. He might have said morality. He might have said, I'm sure he said ethics. And he's talking about physics and science, epistemology, knowledge, truth, objectivity, abstractions, cognitions, qualia, ontology, external world, metaphysics, and few other things like mind and so on, right? I don't need mind in this. You might want to take note of that. I don't need mind. Where would I need it? Right? You could say that maybe the yellow, what's it called? What's this line that is sort of the broken line around the yellow area, which is ontology? You could classify all that as mind. But why would I need that? Right? Why would I need that? I don't need it. Right? It's just another label that is so kind of useless, right? So, and that's where one of the problems come. I'll get back to that probably, right? Okay, when I talk about physics, ethics, epistemology, external world, and other aspects like that, I am talking about abstractions, right? You might call them imaginations or something like that. That might be the case, and that's also why I kept that abstraction called external world yellow rather than green, because it feels like external world is a pure imagination. There's nothing about my cognitions and qualia that make me say, oh, therefore there's an external world. I would like to see if somehow you derive from qualia and cognitions that there is an external world. I can't do it, right? Because if you have an abstraction, epistemology, for instance, right? You are referring back to some part of your experience, would be cognitions and or qualia, right? It sort of points back to the base, which it should. So epistemology, which is an idea of knowledge and truth and objectivity, I've lumped all these three categories together, right? But it makes sense to put them into epistemology, in my opinion. But at least knowledge, which is the key one, right? Well, wouldn't it make sense to say your cognition is knowledge, right? There are lots of things that can be read, but an elephant can only be an elephant, right? Until it might be turned into a rhinoceros. But as long as it's an elephant, it's a fucking elephant, right? But red is not just red. And if it's just red, it's like, I can't use it for anything as such, right? It has to be enveloped in a cognition. So in my sense, it only makes it reasonable to say that knowledge is the cognitions. If I experience elephant, I know elephant. Done. That's all. All other claims of insights are something else. They're not knowledge, right? And only knowledge can be true. And only knowledge can potentially be classified as objective, right? Only knowledge can be classified as true. However you want to put truth together, right? But it has to be based on knowledge. It can't be based on anything else. And then ethics is a moral principle. When you think about ethics, well, isn't it some kind of agreement how it isn't about how I move about, and I move about in something else, which might be that which I know, right? So that knowledge, what I know is how I move myself about, is in reference to what is around me. Otherwise, I'm not moving, right? No, I'm not doing anything if there's nothing else. I do it too. So it's dependent on what is around me. But those are the cognitions, right? That's the knowledge. So ethic has to be based on knowledge. But ultimately, that points back to cognitions, right? Because that's what knowledge is. And the same goes for physics. Physics is a description of how things move about. Well, what moves about are the cognitions, right? You could say the qualia follows around. If there's an elephant, the gray color follows around with the elephant. But you don't really care whether it's gray or it's blue or it's pink or it's polka dot, right? You care that it's an elephant, because that's the important aspect of it. And that's what physics deals with. Physics deals with how these cognitions move about, right? Then we get to the deeper end here, right? Maybe I should clarify. All these four boxes I presented, right? They are all abstractions. They are not cognitions, they're not qualia, right? And they are all, the blue areas points that they are abstractions. They are pointing out from abstractions. But what I'm trying to also convey is they all point back to something, and they all point back to the same thing, which is cognitions, which is that step before abstractions. They have to. That's the aha moment, right? They have to point back to cognitions. They might be able, you might make an abstraction that points directly back to qualia. But it has to point back to something. Maybe it skips the cognition level. When you're hearing music, right? I have a sort of a sense of music, you could say. That could be an abstraction, and it's purely based on sound, right? Or maybe abstract art or something like. I'm not square on that, right? But it goes through cognitions, usually, right? And if it doesn't, in some rare cases, it might go directly to qualia. But those exceptions, which are merely maybe artistic expression, right? Otherwise, it goes through cognitions. It points back to cognition. First of all, it has to, because all of these abstractions are based on cognitions. So why would I do these abstractions if they didn't point anywhere? And they can only point one way, which is back to the last step, which is cognitions. They have to. Otherwise, it's just mental mindfuckery, right? The yellow external world. I would say that is pure imagination. There's nothing about, in this category, C, of abstractions, I can make up shit. I can even maybe, it's a surrealist painting or abstract painting. Where does it all come from? Where does music come from? The Beatles and John Lennon and Paul McCartney, I don't know where it came from. I woke up, I had my breakfast, and there it was yesterday, right? It was like, it was a fully formed, who knows, right? And it's not to go into any kind of woo-woo shit. It's just like, I'm just pointing out that it's imaginary. Some of it might just be imaginary, right? Like, for instance, if I say France, as I pointed out in a recent video, right? France, what the hell is that? If you took somebody who's never seen anything but the African savannah, right? And you have also been to the African savannah and walked around and looked at the animals there, you could take that person and put in what you would call France, and they would have no fucking idea about France, right? Why? Because France is a completely artificial, imaginary label, right? So in the same sense, I think that external world is an imaginary idea. But that idea or imagination or abstraction is still within the category of abstractions. So that's why I put it up there, right, in the yellow box. And there's also another thing that is important to point out. The reason why I put these very thick lines of the borderlines on the boxes is that you can't go any further. You have one imagination, you have one abstraction, you have one idea, whatever you want to call it. And then it has to point back. You can't say, okay, now I created external world, now I can create another abstraction on top of that abstraction. And then you can keep going with all the turtles you want, right? That doesn't work. It is confined that you can't go into other abstractions from this abstraction, because all hell breaks loose. That's a metaphilosophy of mine. That's a rule I have set myself. I'm not going to accept any abstraction based on another abstraction, because all hell breaks loose then, right? And one abstraction, imagination, idea, whatever you want to call it, has to point back to something that is category B or maybe A. It has to point back to cognition, right? So that's why I'm pointing to external world as, what is that? Why am I imagining that? Okay, could there potentially be something outside my ontology? I don't know. How would I know? Because it can't be knowledge, right? Because the knowledge is an abstraction within my ontology. So I can't know it. Knowledge is impossible. In other words, to be quite frank, I can't get to it, right? Because I can't get to it, I can't say it's there. I can neither say that it isn't there. What do? I'm in this sort of matrix scenario, right? Not the movie, but it's either there or not there. What can I do and what can I not do? What should I do? Sort of this 2x2 matrix of some kind, right? Well, I would say, since I can't refute an external world by argument, I can't establish it either. I can't go, just because I can't refute it, doesn't mean I have established it, right? Be careful. This is where these metaphysicians, they go crazy, right? I have to stay within my ontology, because the external world is in itself an abstraction. It is not an external world. My external world is an idea of an external world. It is not an external world. That's important. That's extremely important, right? I can't build further from that external world. So all I have left is to say that abstraction has to point back to cognitions, right? Just like the other abstractions. So I have to say, my cognitions work as a representation. I don't have to say it, but I have chosen a work from an axiom, because I'm talking about something, a reference to something. The idea of my external world is something I attach to the cognitions. I'm not saying anything about an external world, because my external world is purely imaginary. It's a part of my ontology. But I'm saying I'm going to treat my cognitions as representations of something outside my ontology that I do not have access to. That I can do without violating all sorts of shit, right? So if you forget the red bit up there where they're written metaphysics, right? This is basically how my philosophy works. This is the foundational skeleton of the structure of my philosophy. I could possibly expand this to have maybe 5 or 6 subcategories within abstractions. And I could maybe come up with about 10,000 different kinds of abstractions that I could list beside epistemology, ethics, physics, and external world, and so on, right? But these are just the ones that needs to be there in order for me to get this message across, right? So, with that said, the yellow box, that's me, right? That's how I work. Now, I've heard somebody talk about metaphysics, right? Now, there's a reason why I have this box physics down here. Because there seems to be a relation between physics and metaphysics, right? Physics describes how cognitions move about and can be useful in order to predict how they might be composed in the future based on present scenario, right? Now, metaphysics might be an idea about cognitions in an external world, right? Purely from the term. I don't think that that's too far to go there, right? So it's also about the etymology of the term metaphysics, which apparently goes back to Aristotle, and who the hell knows what it actually means, right? So one thing I would like to make very clear here is, please keep metaphysics away from ontology. Don't mix the shit up, right? I like metaphysics to be shoved the fuck away from ontology. Don't mix it up. Don't say that ontology is a subcategory of metaphysics, or metaphysics is a subcategory of ontology, or whatever. Metaphysics, if you were very strict about it, is also an abstraction, right? It's the abstraction about an external world that has been built with an extra abstraction on top of it, which is now I'm going to describe what is in that external world. But all you can describe are some kind of abstraction and sub-abstractions within that actual abstraction you call external world, which is a part of your ontology, right? So you can never step outside your ontology. You can imagine all you want, but since it's an imagination, it's an abstraction, so it's a part of your ontology. You can't get out of it. You can't go through the barrier, so to say, right? The mental barrier, the mind barrier, the ontology barrier, right? Because all you can come up with are abstractions. They are not whatever you want to think it is outside, right? Now, that Bernardo Kastrup thing is, he is saying I imagine an external world. Now I'm going to tell you what it's made of and how it impinges on my ontology. Then he takes that external world, and just like he talks about physicalists do, right? Materialists do, they take it, the map or the territory out, the map out of the territory, the map of the map out of the territory. It's like, but takes the territory out of the map, or the map out of the territory, places it outside in an imaginary story, and say, now I'm going to make that impinge on my ontology in order to explain my qualia. You can't do that, right? Because any kind of external world is an abstraction. Whatever you come up with on top of that is invalid, because you can only have one step, in my opinion. You can't create you can't create first an external world and then try to create a physics or an ontology, a meta-ontology, whatever you want to call it, about that external world, which is another abstraction upon that abstraction you call an external world. It's all going on inside you, right? It's just so imaginary that you all of a sudden convince yourself you're actually talking about an external world. Yes, you call it an external world, but just because you called it an external world doesn't mean it all of a sudden jumped outside your ontology, right? And look at this. The abstractions, you can have all sorts of abstractions. The only thing is they have to all point back to cognition. Because abstractions are based on cognition. And with a few exceptions where there might be something that's actually directly based on qualia, like music maybe, right? So how could an abstraction upon another abstraction then all of a sudden be responsible for qualia? Because you need the qualia and maybe cognitions in order to have these abstractions you created as an external world. And another thing on top of that, which is metaphysics within an external world, which is an abstraction upon an abstraction. This is what I'm talking about with all these cloud castles. So When you make this leap, you are violating a basic paradox, a basic limitation of your thinking. You have to stay with your ontology. It doesn't mean you can't have the abstraction called external world and treat some part of your ontology, in my case, cognitions, as representations of an external world. Because you have the idea of an external world, the abstraction, but you're still working with what you have. You're not coming up with some elaborate, pattern of excitations and ripples and shit that are responsible for all this ontology. It's stupid. It's circular. That's why I keep saying, if you have this ontology and you come up with the abstraction called external world, whatever you do, you can't go around and come back and say, now I have an idea why there is an ontology. Either it doesn't change the ontology, then what the hell do I need that metaphysics for? And if you start to change the ontology based on that metaphysics, you are changing that foundation you used to get to the metaphysics that then changed that foundation you used. That doesn't work either. So in any case, it's circular or useless to do metaphysics. And it's a violation of where you are when you're doing abstractions within your ontology. So it's completely fucked up, right? So I hope it makes kind of sense to you, because I think it's actually pretty straightforward, right? It's just that usually I think that the deeper the level you get into this, the more important, the bigger the change further down the road when you get into epistemology, ethics and physics and whatever, the bigger influence that the change in potential thinking deep down in this ontology and metaphysics, whatever you want to call it, right? The bigger changes they make, but when you come back. So when you go down there, that psychology of yours, your fears and your all that shit, right, may very well start to influence what you're actually thinking, because you don't want to get to conclusions that leads to something like mommy and daddy were crazy, right? Something like that. I'm just saying, right? So be careful with people who present this. Be careful with me. I might be completely fucked up in this, right? I don't think so, right? Because when things start to hang together in a fairly simple manner, because I can, wake up and get about and survive and, whatever, right? It's not that complicated. I don't need to write a 100-page, 50-page book on ontology. This is all I need, right? It works perfectly for me, right? It might need a few adjustments. I'm confident that, but it's not. It doesn't have to be changed or completely wiped out or said it has been refuted. You have to start all over. No. It's sort of iterating, recursive kind of adjusting adjusting here, adjusting there. Right? It's not like my bicycle has a flat tire. I have to get rid of it and get a new bicycle. Right? That's not what you do. Right? That's not how things works, in my opinion. So if you have to completely scrap your philosophy time and time again, you're not doing it right, in my opinion, right? If you have a philosophy where you sort of, let's say, move forward in how you work with your philosophy, you might reach a point where saying, there's something that's weird here. Let me take a few steps back and see, did I do something weird? And then, but it's only a few steps back. It's not back to square one and delete everything, right? I like this kind of dynamic approach to doing philosophy. And if I sat here and present, this is my latest presentation of my philosophy. If I said this is what I created 10 years ago, I haven't changed it. I would be concerned if I was you, right? If I were you. This guy has just come up with something and he's just sticking to it and defending it with his life like an idiot, right? It has to be dynamic. Because it's not, you can't sit down and come up with it's like inventing a car, right? The first cars were basically horse carriages where they took off the horse and put on a motor, right? There we have it, right? And look where we are now, right? They look nothing like horse carriages, but there's still some box on four wheels, right? So it's like things have to be optimized, but the foundations should more or less be the same, right? There's some core sort of minimal viable product or something like that, right? That transcends through all your philosophy, right? That you might end up in a position, in a situation where you take a really big jump or change, which I was when I discovered that materialist paradox, right? The inside outside paradox, right? And I'm also illustrating in here the inside outside, right? You don't have access to any outside. Because if you have access to it, it must be an inside, right? So now, however you put it around, if I access it, it must be inside. Then it's not an outside. So as long as it's an outside, by definition, I do not have access to it, right? Otherwise, you're violating the whole idea of inside-outside, right? Okay, so I don't want to scream at you, but I'm very passionate about this, right? I'm extremely passionate about philosophy. And I've been passionate about it for more than 10 years, right? Almost 13 or 14 years now, right? Something like that. 13 years, maybe. 13 years. Yeah. 12, 13 years at least, right? And I just keep going. I'm not backing out. I'm not stepping down, right? I want to get to a fucking good functional. And how cumbersome does it have to be? I'm rejecting metaphysics because it's stupid, right? It's sort of the red lights are on there, metaphysics. Don't go there. Don't go down the metaphysics road, right? Take the yellow ontology road, right? There's a structure to it. I'm setting some philosophical rules for what the hell I can do, right? It seems when I'm listening to other people, they're just, first of all, throwing words around, right? Left and right. And they are violating categories, they are violating semantics, they're equivocating, they're using the same words for different things, or using different words for the same thing, and they're sort of, it's all over the place. There's no structure in philosophy, right? And these tax-funded academics, they're grinding themselves down to some little minute detail somewhere, right? That is not fruitful. Because I don't have the rest of my life to do this. I have to get to some conclusions, right? And I feel I'm getting somewhere. I have been working on a book that is sort of, it's very weird with this book thing, because I have written something and then I go away from it and I sort of don't want to come back. I don't know what it is, because I'm fucking fascinated by philosophy. But this book is like it's this, this ball and chain around my foot or something like that. I feel like it, right? And I think it's I'm sort of a kind of guy who sort of, if there's something if I don't feel like doing it, I'm sort of, okay, then I don't do it. But I'm starting thinking, why am I not wanting to do it? And I think it's because what I've written so far doesn't work. It's not completely crazy, as I say, about these iterations of philosophy, but there's something about it that it's not a good approach. I think it has to be more like this. All this text-based shit, it just ends up being some kind of academic shit, right? And there's so much of it that it's almost like you want to puke, right? So I'm trying to imagine another way to approach it. It has to be, personally, in my later years, when I was younger, I actually read quite a few books. I've never been a big reader. I'm a slow reader, and I'm like, I don't have the patience for reading. But some book, if I get hooked, I can read them, right? I've read a few books in my years, right? But in the last 10 years, I maybe read 4 or 5 books or something like that, right? And some of them haven't even read everything. And I'm like, if I start to read a book and it doesn't make sense to me, I don't care for it, I put it on the shelf or sell it, right? I don't care for boring books, right? I don't feel that I have to read anything. I am a philosopher, right? I am not a reader. I'm not a book fan. I'm a philosopher. So I'm doing the philosophy. I'm not reading about philosophy, telling you about other people's philosophy. I'm doing my own philosophy. And that's why, if I'm feeling like that, the same may be for the rest of the world, who are actually the ones I would like to communicate with. I don't care for academia. They are circle jerking themselves and sucking each other's dicks, right, to be quite frank. They are living in their ivory tower. They're, trying to protect their own little niche. They're not going to give you anything at the end. There might be a few nuggets here and there that could inspire you. They're not going to give you anything like this. Never in a fucking billion years. You will only get it from a guy like me. Right? And there are very few of guys like me. I mean, show me if there are others like me that does things like this, and a freelance philosopher like me. Show me, please. Right? Help me. Help a brother out, right? So, metaphysics is screwed. Get rid of it, right? I don't need it. I don't need metaphysics. All I need is, let me see if I can get rid of it. Like this. Right? There it is. That's my philosophy. That's my philosophy. Right? Let me see if I can actually adjust my webcam window here. Like this. There it is. This is my philosophy. In short, simple terms, right? Mind you. But this is what there is. It's all confined into my experience, my ontology. It's all my ontology. That's all there is. In the sense that ontology references, for instance, abstractions. And all these abstractions is a part of the whole thing that is me, so to say, right? It might be more complex. We're talking about meta-consciousness and awareness of things. Yeah, sure. There might be a whole layer of awareness that sort of does this. But it might also just be an abstraction that can look at all the other abstractions, right? Or maybe all I'm presenting here as ontology is only meta-consciousness. Maybe there's only meta-consciousness. This is meta-consciousness. Maybe an extraction of consciousness is taking a part of your meta-conscious, what is usually called meta-conscious, and extracting it out to a consciousness that you are aware of. But since you're aware of it, it must also be a part of your meta-consciousness. Otherwise, you wouldn't be aware. So this might all just be awareness, right? And this might be where somebody like Berkeley goes into, well, it's all mine then. All I have access to is my awareness. That's all there is. And it emanates of Hume also, maybe to some extent, though I hesitate because I'm a little unsure about how Hume relates to these things, right? But I remember, at least in his treatise, Hume's treatise, he writes about giving some kudos to Berkeley for being one of the new interesting avenues in philosophy, as far as I recall, right? Okay, so there you have it. Let me have your comments, right? Let me have your comments. What do you think of this? Would it work for you, right? It works for me, right? Is there something I completely overlooked, or some aspect you might find? Are they just some abstraction you would like to be there, and I haven't shown them because my PowerPoint can't show you 10,000 different abstractions. I would lose a complete overview of what I'm doing, right? And this is also a problem in many, somebody like Bernardo Kastrup maybe in particular, that they get lost in details. You lose the overview of what they're talking about. I would like to have something to get back to. If you just have one little card like this. Okay, you talked about knowledge in there. Knowledge, that's epistemology. but you said knowledge of qualia. Do you mean qualia through cognitions? Or it's like you have sort of a backup card where you say, okay, you mentioned something over there. I think that term is supposed to be used over here, right? Are you not violating something here? But when you're sitting in sort of the recent monistic idealism stream, but there's 8 hours where he's basically rambling on and rambling on and rambling on. You lose sight of this. You lose the overview. And I would have to deduce that that's exactly the purpose. You just have to be duped into thinking that you're too stupid to, it's because you're too stupid to figure it out, right? That you just accept whatever he rambles on and say he's got to be smart, right? So, to get back to the full picture here, right? All that Bernardo Kastrup is talking about is the red area up here. He's talking about the other stuff also. But he conflates metaphysics and ontology and says it's all the same thing. It's all made of mind, because he made this punctured line around all his phenomena, right? All these things in there in my ontology are phenomena. And he says, this is mind. He says, as I've said repeatedly, then he goes take this incredible leap that is, I guess everything is made of mind then. And then if I say that my metaphysics outside my ontology is also made of mind, then I can explain everything by mind. But then he said, oh my God, maybe I just made myself a solipsist. Okay, so I have to say that my ontology is somehow dissociated from the rest of mind. So there's mind in metaphysics, there's mind in mind in my ontology, and then he sort of also says because everything is mind, metaphysics and ontology melts together and become one, so to say, because it must be the same thing because it's all mind then, right? So this is where it rolls completely out of control, right? All this dissolves, all interconnection, everything is dissolved. He just calls, it's a dashboard. It's not really important, right? Let me get into my metaphysics and tell you about my ripples, right? This pink area up here is Crazyville, right? This is Woo-Woo Land, Crazyville, fantastic stories, cloud castles, and whatever you want to call it, right? Stick to your fucking ontology. Have a nice day. See you in the next one.